Hi everyone, I'm Gavin. I'm the costing and performance accountant at Chester, and me and Sophie are going to talk to you a little bit today of why we decided to turn our finance team into a rainbow department, and just a little bit more background on the rainbow badge scheme and how we deliver it in Chester. So I'm just going to pass over to Sophie for the first part of that session.
Oh, hi, Gavin. Thank you for introducing, for the introduction there, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. So my name's Sophie. I'm the Equality and Diversity Manager at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about Rainbow Badge Scheme here and how we implemented it as part of our trust initiatives to better support people from the LGBT community. What I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes is just talk you through some of the highlights of what we did and why, and the training that we decided to introduce as part of our launch. I hope that some people will have received some intro into LGBT history, which is the baseline of our training here in Chester. But if not, then that is absolutely fine. I will be going through everything from scratch. So when we joined the Rainbow Badge Scheme in February 2020, we did it as part of LGBT History Month. Prior to our launch, we had an interest expressed both at grassroots level and also from execs. So it was great to receive emails and messages and tweets from staff asking, why aren't we in the Rainbow Badge Scheme? When are we going to be in the Rainbow Badge Scheme? So that was really encouraging that there was such a keen focus and desire for us to be part of this much bigger picture across NHS England. So for anyone who is new, who doesn't know the Rainbow Badge Scheme, it started as an initiative from Evelyn London Children's Hospital, and it was set up to make a positive difference by promoting the message of LGBT plus inclusion, and it's now been taken up by hospitals and health service across the whole NHS, and it's just one of the ways in which we show that these services aim to be open, non-judgmental and inclusive places for LGBTQ plus people. So far, the Rainbow Badge has been one of the most successful and widespread initiatives in raising LGBT awareness. I was here listening to part of the previous session where Caroline was talking about there's been a little bit of politics about who uses the rainbow, but I'm pleased to say that the rainbow is an inclusive sign for everybody. So it's wonderful that we see so many rainbows about these days in these difficult times. So prior to our launch, what we did is we liaised with to a large extent with our gender and sexuality group at the Trust, and they're a group who consists of stakeholders, charities, staff, and also ex-patients. Like us, they're keen to ensure that the badge actually meant something and that people who wore them understood the commitment and responsibility about being an ally and had the necessary information available to them in order to be an ally on a day-to-day basis. So in order to achieve this, we set up a task and finish group to organise and implement training content, communication and trust-wide awareness of the Rainbow Badge Scheme. At these meetings, we had some discussion on how you quite often hear people say when any equality initiative comes in, people say, well, we treat everyone the same anyway, or we treat everyone with respect anyway. And I would certainly hope that's true. However, that's not what initiatives like this are about. We hear the statement, we treat everyone the same. And of course, we're not all the same. So being an ally is about understanding that we're not all the same, and that we understand each person's lived experience so that we can support them in an empathetic and informed way. It's about how genuine our support is. How much time have we actually taken to learn about the journey of that individual we claim to be an ally for? So, as I say, we didn't want to just hand out badges. We wanted to give a real insight into the LGBT journey with the NHS. Sadly, the NHS has not always been a safe or happy place for the LGBT plus community. And if I could just ask Gavin just to go back a couple of slides to, that's it, that's the one, Gavin. Journey, and it's not always been a happy place for people, and this is something that we thought it was vital to raise awareness of in our training sessions about people's not only their lived experience in the whole community, but also with regards to the actual NHS itself. So just to let everybody know, I'm going to be sending a copy of these slides and also our training slides over today to our facilitator so that she can send those out to you, and you'll be able to look at these quotes in more depth. I do appreciate and apologise that I can see the writing is quite small, but I will make sure that everybody gets a copy of these slides. So just an example, though, pulling out some of this information. This is information that's been taken from reports from Stonewall and the LGBT Foundation, and it cited health-related information, such as it highlights there more LGBT teenagers attempt self-harm than any of their peers, and that's certainly something we've seen an increase in our A&E department during COVID. It also highlights that more than 2 in 5 young trans people have attempted to take their own lives. So as such, it's absolutely vital that we get our services, our approach and our attitude right for people. It's also important that as badge wearers, we're aware that wearing a badge is not about being all things to all people. So with the best will in the world, nobody can be. So it's about being informed, empathetic, and able to signpost people to the right places for support for them. We also talk in our training at this point about what queries or questions or situations badge wearers are likely to come across, and there's a big range in that. But again, it's not essential that we have all the answers. What is important is that we're aware of local services and some of the history in order to be able to refer people to the right place for them. So just moving on to the next slide. As part of, you can see there a very large building, the history of the 1829 building. So a vital element that we wanted to cover in our training was the history of persecution for LGBT people. And we wanted to include local knowledge and make people aware of just how recent actually some of this is. And a lot of people who now need our services, especially older LGBT plus people, have lived experience of when the NHS was a frightening place for them. And this is especially something now that we are seeing with LGBT people who present with dementia, delirium or general confusion. So when they actually go back in time to a time when the NHS was not such a positive place, then that can be incredibly traumatic for them, and it can prompt issues such as not wanting to tell people what the next of kin was. Old mental health conditions can re-emerge as the person feels that they're back in the time period where they couldn't live as their authentic selves. And that can be incredibly traumatic for them coming back in. So this is one of our main points of discussion. You'll see in front of you the 1829 building in the left-hand corner. This is a building at the Countess of Chester that used to be an asylum. And as late as the 60s and 70s, LGBT people were still being sent there as to be treated for a mental health problem, because being confused about your gender or being having homosexual feelings was seen very much as a mental health problem. So this is the reality for the NHS of a lot of people that we see today. In the magazine Vintage Cheddar, again, I'll send a copy of this when I send the slides over. DJ Pete Price, some of you may be aware, gives his own experience of being in the 1829 building in the 1960s. And he tells a quite harrowing story of his time there, where he, at 14 years old, he went to see his GP, talked about his homosexual feelings and the effect they were having on him. His GP laughed, prescribed him with tranquilizers and sent him away. over the next 4 years, those feelings intensified, and when he was 18, he confided in his mum that he was attracted to other men. His mum begged him to go into the 1829 building and receive psychiatric treatment. And he said what happened when he got there, he was given a pile of male pornography and some alcohol, locked in a room to drink the alcohol and look through the pornography. He was then given antrobus, which made him violently sick. And the idea back then is that if somebody was made to be sick while looking at pornography from the same sex, it would actually cure their homosexual feelings. Of course, didn't work, didn't happen, and induced a lot of trauma on the people there. So in this training, we discussed that and the lived experience of LGBT people who are now only in their 50s and 60s. It's easy to think of this being a Victorian goings on, but actually some of the people now that have had these experiences are still relatively young, and they have a very different experience than young LGBT people presenting in their teens and 20s. I'd like to point out, however, that the challenges that each party are facing are not easier or worse, they're just different, and that's what a lot of our training is about, trying to understand how it's been for that individual. So we include discussion on the impact of LGBT people with dementia and the impact of history. We also have discussion on the 1980s, where a lot of people remember the 80s as being a very liberal, anything goes. We had a lot of gay icons. We had Freddie Mercury, Elton John. However, it was actually a tough time to be gay. There was a lot of hate crime about, something known as gay bashing, where groups would actually go out and attack people just for being gay. There was the AIDS pandemic and quite a frightening AIDS advert. And AIDS led to a lot of homophobia and a lot of hate crime, and this is something that people now presenting in their 50s and 60s and 70s actually lived through. So we felt as a task and finish group it was important that people now had this insight. And if I can just move on to the next slide. We see here where it says the journey more recent than you think. We wanted to cover quite a bit about legislation as well, but talk about the impact of that legislation on people in our local community. So we include here, you can see repeal section 28. And this is information about, gives us an opportunity to highlight that even as late as 2000, initiatives like the Rainbow Badge Scheme would actually have been unlawful. So just to clarify for anyone who's not aware of clause 28, this is a piece of legislation that existed in the UK from 1988 to 2003. And just to quote a part of that legislation to you, it prohibited any promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. It was introduced by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, and it meant that in effect from 1988, there was, if you were part of a public sector organisation, you were not allowed to do anything that showed any support for the LGBT community and anything that was seen as a promotion of homosexuality. So the impact of that is, on top of the difficulties people were facing in the 80s as a result of the AIDS pandemic, it also meant that no government funded body could openly support any LGBT people or groups. So it meant that a lot of lesbian, gay and bisexual student support groups or networks actually had to close or limit their activities for fear of being in breach of the Act. Youth clubs, schools, NHS services, none of these organisations, local councils, were allowed to do anything that would support homosexual groups. They couldn't rent out rooms for people to have support meetings, youth groups. All of that disappeared. So for people now, that might promote shock, and it does in our training provoke conversation and helps people gain a real appreciation for the importance of schemes like the Rainbow Badge Scheme. It gives us all a chance to reflect on the freedoms that we now take for granted when you actually think that in 2002 the rainbow badge scheme would have been unlawful. We have come a long way. So if I can just move on to our final slide, our next slide, where you can see here Chester Pride. And that's from September 2019. So sadly, we didn't have one in 2020, and we won't have a 21 because of COVID, but we certainly hope that to be back in 2022. So now, I hope you can see here, we've got the march in the right-hand corner. In the left-hand corner. In the right-hand corner, we can see some protesters, and also in the bottom photo, we can also see some protesters in the background holding up misquotes of the Old Testament with some very strong anti-gay messages. So I always include this in the training because we wanted to show that many people in Chester still do experience hate and prejudice. A lot of would-be rainbow badge wearers think that, of course, prejudice and this sort of open statements against LGBT people is something of the past. Sadly, that's not true. We use these images to start conversations about how the existence of hate crime, honour-based violence, domestic violence and family abandonment are still in existence, and our role in understanding, recognising and supporting people who might be actually subject to or going through these things in their lives today. Again, we stress that it's not about being all things to all people. We supply our rainbow badge wearers with a booklet for all local services, ongoing community support, events, local LGBT support groups and charities such as Mermaids, Body Positive and Story House, so that they can point people in the right direction and ensure that that person at the same time as being referred also feels that they've been understood and listened to. So I'll end the presentation there. I'm delighted to say that the response from staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital has been excellent. We run our training once a month and we're often asked to do additional sessions. So our finance department have been incredibly supportive of this initiative, and we're one of the first very keen departments to become a rainbow badge department. They very kindly asked me to attend their team meetings, keen to highlight that the rainbow badges are for supporting staff, potential applicants and visitors as much as patients, and ensuring that the NHS can achieve an inclusive culture for the future. So I'm just going to say now, thank you to everyone for listening, and I'm going to hand back to my colleague Gavin.
Thanks, Sophie. So I just wanted to go through a few of the reasons why in finance we chose to become a rainbow badge department. So firstly, it was around the equality and diversity and inclusion agendas, obviously getting a lot bigger and becoming a lot more sort of in the limelight and the centre. So we wanted to endorse that and sort of do something to move forward with that agenda. We felt it was important that the whole team was involved, that it didn't just fall to a couple of individuals who either identify within as LGBTQ+ or just a couple of allies. That we wanted to make sure that everyone was involved. We'd had positive feedback from a few members of the team who'd already been on the training, and we wanted to make sure that it's not just about patient care. Yes, that's important and that's a big part of it, but it's how we deal with other people in the department and all those unseen differences that people are usually quite oblivious to. They're just completely unaware. And we have had some issues of unintentional discrimination, so no one going out of their way to discriminate against anyone, but by virtue of treating other people more favourably, it's then led to minority groups being treated unfavourably. So no one directly or intentionally going out of their way to discriminate, but that being the unintended consequence of some of their actions, and just how we begin to tackle that when people aren't even aware that they're doing it, they're not aware that there's an issue. And we sort of saw this as the first step to highlighting to people that there may be an issue with how they're acting sometimes. Yeah, and just in terms of what we gained from that training, obviously it was a better understanding about current issues, the context around sort of the LGBTQ+ history. Our offices are now actually based in the 1829 building, so to think just, you know, a number of years ago that people were actually being sectioned there, it's just very different, and a lot of the issues that Sophie discussed on the training weren't things that we'd actually considered a lot, particularly around dementia patients and how it's changed in their lifetimes, and that they forget that it's changed, or that they forget they've come out, or that they've gone through a transition process, and it's how you deal with those patients. And it's just very difficult that you don't think about these sort of issues. So it's quite good to bring those to everyone's attention. I'd say better awareness for patients, and awareness of the work currently being done either in the trust or sort of in local community with the charities and other bodies, and sort of events like this, just bringing them to people's attention and just making it clear that they are relevant to everyone, even if you don't necessarily identify. There will be people in your personal life, people that you work with, patients that you see in the corridor, that it does impact, and it's important that everyone's aware of it. Just because you think you're inclusive and you think that there's not a problem doesn't mean that there isn't a problem there, and it might cause issues that you wouldn't expect for people. So we just give that sort of general awareness to begin with.
We have got a question. There's probably going to be several, but the first thing is, I mean, great work that you guys have done. I mean, some of the things we talked about is about, raising awareness, discussion. How do we make our departments truly inclusive? I suppose the first part of that is, you mentioned there that in the main it's been okay. There's been some unintentional discrimination, but have you had any, during setting these up, you had any negative feedback or pushback from putting people through this, or making a suggestion that this training can take place and so on?
Well, I would say certainly there was a lot of appetite for the rainbow badges. We had a lot of support from existing staff. The pushback that we did receive, which was very minimal, is something that happens whenever there's any big focus on any particular equality and diversity initiative. That a couple of people asked, well, why are we just doing something for LGBTQ? Why not BAME? Why not disabled? And that is quite a common pushback with any type of equality and diversity initiatives. However, it was minimal, and it was actually incredibly positive, because it gave me an opportunity to explain, well, we do have things for other groups as well, and that they are very welcome to join those initiatives for other groups. And this is very much a case of, when we have training sessions to understand the lived experience of different minority groups, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and bespoke training is always very, very important. So it actually opened the ground to invite people and raise awareness of all sorts of different training and different discussions that we have.
Oh, lovely. Okay, thank you for that. I suppose there's sort of a follow-on question for that. Have you got any tips on engaging with staff who might understand the full agenda? So I suppose it's a similar type question, really, but what organisations may have.
So if people don't understand the agenda, sometimes it is helpful to tie things into particular awareness events, to maybe utilise a patient story or a staff story, because people who are thinking, well, patient care is the most important thing to me, need to understand the impact of, for example, the history of LGBT people on their patient journey today. So we find patient stories very, very powerful, very effective, and that people engage with them very quickly, because if they always, no matter what, they want to get it right for that patient. And likewise, managers want to get it right for their staff members. So we find that those stories are incredibly valuable.
Lovely, thank you. An earlier speaker, Caroline, mentioned about the COVID rainbow thank you, which has been made into badges in some places. Do you think this has an impact on the effectiveness of the original rainbow badge?
There was some initial confusion. There was some initial confusion as to whether the new rainbow badges were going to, in effect, eclipse the ally badges, and we had some quite extensive discussion about this. The rainbow badges that have come out regarding COVID do have the thank you on, so are quite are quite clear. However, what we wanted to make sure was that going forward, people weren't confused between the two. And I think this is where rainbow badge training really finds its value, in that we don't just give out the rectangular badges. We actually make sure that they're not given to anybody until they've attended the training, and that gives us an opportunity to promote them differently and highlight the need to actually enter into different discussions and the responsibilities of being an ally in a different way, whereas the other rainbow badges are given out to all staff members. So it's about how you promote each badge.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Just in terms of this, there's not any other questions coming up on the screen, but just in terms of myself, I suppose really the key to all of this, do you feel, I mean, clearly it's made, in terms of raising awareness and raising discussion, it's having an impact on that. But would you say, I mean, obviously the game we all aim for is that truly inclusive environment. Do you think you're heading towards that? Are you feeling that it's making a difference?
Definitely. We find that that staff attitude, particularly over COVID, there's been a lot in the news around equality and diversity and inclusiveness, and a lot of attitude has changed from the perception that we need to treat everybody the same to the understanding that actually we need to understand we're not all the same and we all have very individual needs, and it's about how we make sure we have equality of opportunity and support people to have a good workplace experience and a good patient experience. Lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's come to the end of our questions now. It's been a very interesting speech that you've provided for us, piece you've provided for us. It's very thought-provoking, certainly from my point of view. I'll be thinking about that as I go back into my organisation. So thank you all, thank you both very, very much for coming. Oh, thank you, Maria. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot then. Thanks everyone.